Greenville, but we always pronounced it Greensville with an S. That was home. Greensville's very much like Plains, Georgia, if you pardon my comparison. Same part of the country and same sort of tiny rural village. You hear folks talking about being poor, but listen here. When I say we were poor, I'm spelling it with a capital P. Even compared to other blacks in Greensville, we were on the bottom of the ladder looking up at everyone else. Nothing below us except the ground. Fact is, I was fairly old when I got my first pair of shoes. Indoor plumbing was something we never even dreamed of, and yet I was taken care of. 2 women loved me. It sounds strange, but I actually had 2 mothers. My father's name was Bailey Robinson, and to tell the truth, I wouldn't bet a lot of money he and my mother ever were married. My mother's name was Aretha. Retha was what everyone called her. The old man wasn't part of my life. He was a tall dude, I remember that, but he was hardly ever around. He drove steel or spikes on the cross tees on the railroad between Perry, Florida, and Adel, Georgia. Sometimes he came around to see Mama, but not very often. He was so big and she was so small that people often confused them for a father and daughter. I recall one morning, I still must have been a very small child, when he was leaving the house and I asked him if he was going to get on top of Mama and play with her. I knew they was always doing something like that when I was supposed to be sleeping, but I didn't know exactly what it was. Those little shotgun shacks were tiny, and you were just about on top of each other anyway. So Bailey came and went. I really didn't get to know the man. Maybe because he worked on the railroad and was always gone. Maybe because he didn't care. Can't say. But in the country we had 2 kinds of marriages, common law and the normal type. Relationships between men and women, though, are things that a little child couldn't easily understand, and to this day I'm not certain what the entanglements were all about. I do know that Bailey's first wife, a woman named Mary Jane, was someone who loved and cared for me like a mother. Probably it was during his marriage to her that Bailey had a love affair with Retha, which is how I got here. Bailey had another wife after he split up with Mary Jane. Her name was Stella, but I didn't really know her. Yeah, Mary Jane took to me like I was her own. She lost a son named Jabbo, and maybe I became a substitute. Who knows? There's a lot about this part of my life, the earliest years, that remain mysterious, but you have to remember that I was too young to do any serious questioning. And besides, a little kid wasn't supposed to be asking any questions. In spite of all this confusion about who was loving who, living with who, or leaving who, I do know that 2 women, Mama and Mary Jane, bathed me in affection and cared for me as long as they were both alive. Fact is, I call Retha Mama and Mary Jane Mother. Mama was small, 110 pounds or so, and she was also sickly. It wasn't that she couldn't work. In fact, she worked all her natural life. She quit school after the 5th grade and worked the tobacco and cotton fields, snapped beans, and hulled peas. But now her main job was washing and ironing. Other women in our neighborhood gave her some of the extra work they got from white folks. It was like subcontracting. Hardly made any money at it, but whatever there was went towards clothing and feeding me. Mama was a rare human being. She was no softy, really strict as hell. I mean, discipline was her middle name. She showed me that discipline is a kind of love. And that's something I believe to this day. Mama taught me all kinds of things, big lessons, little lessons, which I've kept with me and use every day of my life. She was a weak woman, but that was only physically. In all other ways, she was strong. Didn't drink, smoke, or swear. Lots of rules, lots of practical, down-to-earth common sense. And at the top of the list were two. You do not beg, and you do not steal. We slept together, Mama and me, till I was 11 or 12, or else I slept on the floor. It was very cool down there, especially on hot summer nights. We lived in all sorts of different places, moving from pillar to post. Often we found ourselves in the kind of shack which would have gone up in smoke at the drop of a match. But somehow we made it. Mary Jane and Mama were two very different women. Mary Jane had a couple of good jobs. Her first gig was for white people, supposedly one of the older families, the Osbys. And she also worked at the sawmill. Actually, Greensville was a sawmill town, and women worked there alongside men. Truth is, most men today would shy away from the sort of work Mary Jane did, lifting huge wet boards and throwing them into the steamer. This might surprise you, but Mary Jane and Mama got along just fine. Mama was a lot stricter and Mary Jane much more lenient. But that didn't matter none. For instance, Mary Jane wouldn't let Mama whip me. And usually Mama didn't argue with her. Maybe that's because she knew that Mary Jane was always giving me stuff, little foods that I especially liked, and small articles of clothing. I also remember that when they were still together, Bailey and Mary Jane ran a cafe not far from my grandmother's house, the kind of place that sold candies and bread and beer. I must have been around 3 years old at this time. Mary Jane called me her monkey doodle. Yeah, that was her name for me, and she was an awfully protective woman. On the other hand, Mama had a little more vision about preparing me for the real world. She let me roam, let me make my own mistakes, let me discover the world for myself. There were 2 sons born to Aretha, my brother George, and me. George was a year younger than me, and he was a phenomenal kid. By the time he was 3, he could add, multiply, and divide. Neighbors came by just to watch him do his little mathematics. They were fascinated by him. George also had a highly developed talent for inventing games and designing toys. Since there was no money for stuff like that, you had to make your own. And George did just that, putting together tiny cars and other devices with strings and wires. The kid was inventive, and in many ways, brilliant. I could see that Mama was amazed by George, and so was everyone else living around us. The 2 of us were little free spirits. We ran off into the woods, threw pebbles and rocks into the streams. We picked blackberries, and we laughed when Mama yelled, "Get out of that berry patch for a rattlesnake up and bite your head off." I can see the landscape, the pecan, chinaberry, and pine trees, the pigs and the cows and the chickens. I remember hog killing time. I can see men shooting hogs in the ears and cutting their throats to let the blood drain away. Then a short while later, we'd be chewing on that same animal for dinner. Country folk don't miss nothing on the pig. Ears, feet, insides and outsides. We ate everything on the hog except the oink. Neck bones, chitlins, collard greens, rice smothered with onion gravy, cabbage with thick pieces of ham, sweet watermelon. Man, we might have been poor, but we ate good. If we had chicken, it had to be on Sunday, our church day. Oh, yes, Lord. Mama believed in going to church. Ours was the Shiloh Baptist Church, and I liked it best for the singing. Church was simple. Preacher sang.